there's an intermingling of survivor emotions. When Bush tries to connect 9/11 with Iraq falsely in political and military terms, there's a psychological tendency of the mind, and especially the unconscious mind, to blur these distinctions and to equate almost any humiliation or attack with another. And that's one reason why Bush could have a certain success in the Bush administration in their falsifications of these kind. It's also true that one has to look at survivor psychology in general, and in work on survivor psychology, I found that there is a death imprint which has to do with the death encounter of immediate survivors that lasts. I call it indelible imprint. There is a struggle with feeling and not feeling, or what I call psychic numbing. There's a struggle with self-condemnation or guilt over having survived or not having done more to combat the forces of the disaster. But there's primarily an overall need for survivor meaning. You must give some meaning to the death encounter if you're to have meaning in the rest of your life. And that meaning often takes the form of a survivor mission. If you look at parents whose children die of leukemia, for instance, they may take on meaning of that terrible survival by devoting themselves to helping research on leukemia. There is in all this what has been called a debt to the dead, and the dead are the authorities that are called upon. And there's also in this process of survivor meaning a process by which war begets war. The survivor meaning of one war is likely to give rise to the next war. That's why historians always equate World War I and World War II as being part of the same historical era, and if you follow the Nazi way of surviving World War I, they were so focused on their survivor mission that they would call out the names of the fallen German soldiers killed in World War I as though they were still present in those party rallies. There are levels of survivors. There are the immediate survivors, people who fought in Vietnam, or families who lost people in Vietnam or Iraq or in 9/11, or those directly involved. And there are the more distant or historical survivors, the rest of us, whose country was nonetheless attacked by 9/11 and in whose name the Vietnam and Iraq wars were and are being fought. The first group, the immediate survivors, have a visceral response and struggle to pull themselves together. The more distant survivors tend to be more ideational or ideological, as they often do the formulating of the survivor mission, especially when they are officials in high places. And there's a process, a back and forth process between the immediate survivors and the more distant or historical survivors, so that it's significant, for instance, that Vietnam veterans told me that for long periods of time, the most popular song they played was "I Feel Like I'm Fixing to Die Rag," Country Joe and the Fish, which was the most powerful anti-war song of that era. And similarly, I heard an Iraq anti-war veteran say that he came to some of his ideas after reading Noam Chomsky. There's a back and forth process, interaction between the immediate and more distant survivors. Now, if you look at Vietnam, 9/11, and Iraq, and I'll do that just very briefly, each has polarized survivor meanings and survivor missions, so that we understood Vietnam to lead to a survivor mission of restraint against the use of American military power in distant parts of the world with very unclear purposes. But there was a group of political leaders which took a polar opposite survivor mission. And you can recognize it in George Bush Sr., when he declares at the end of the first Gulf War, not anything about the heroism of American soldiers, but rather, by God, we have kicked the Vietnam Syndrome once and for all. The Vietnam Syndrome being a kind of euphemism for American weakness. And when you look at the second Iraq War, the present Iraq War, you find the so-called Vulcans, named by themselves, Cheney, Rumsfeld, Powell, Wolfowitz, Armitage, and Rice, all reacted powerfully to the Vietnam War, whether they fought in it or not, and mostly they didn't, in which, as James Mann, who wrote a very important book, The Rise of the Vulcans, says, the defeat in Vietnam led to a preoccupation with first regaining and then maintaining American military power. And he's talking about a preoccupation on the part of these Vulcans, the ones who formulated around George Bush the Iraq War. Similarly, in 9/11, you have the official survivor meaning of the administration, which it embraces right away that we're embarked on a, quotes, war on terrorism, and these, if we're to give any meaning to what happened to us, it's because they envy us, period, as opposed to an alternative survivor mission which says, hey, let's look at this. Why did they want to kill us in this way? And while taking action against those guilty of the murders of 9/11, one would still seek to grasp the sources of that violence. That was more or less taboo, at least attempted taboo, in relation to the immediate official 9/11 response. Americans are caught in between, and more Americans sought to find some sort of meaning underneath 9/11, and we found some heroic behavior on the part of family members who insisted upon an investigation of the sources of 9/11 against the will of the administration, succeeded in getting that investigation and even in prolonging the investigation when more time was needed. And families are still speaking out on the failure to implement all sorts of intelligence reforms and on other matters. If you look at Iraq, I've tried to demonstrate that it is a survivor mission, so embraced, even though it existed as a plan long before that, of both the Vietnam War and 9/11. But once a war begins, it develops survivor meaning and survivor missions of its own. Putting it simply, there is a traditional survivor mission in war. We must not have let them die in vain. And therefore, you prosecute the war ever more vigorously so that they will not have died in vain. It's a formula for perpetual war. But there is an alternative survivor mission, which goes back as far as Homer. If you read the Iliad, you find that, yes, there's a glorification of military heroism and of the immortal goals of the warrior, but underneath that there's an undercurrent of sadness, loss, and periodic statements that it's not worth it, the horrors are not justified, these grotesque things that we see and experience could have been prevented. And you see that alternative survivor mission taking shape and asking whether the only way that these men and women will not have died in vain might be that we learn a lesson from them about that kind of war making.